Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time you are tuning in. Welcome to Homesteading and Gardening in the Suburbs with Misfit Gardening. I'm Emma from Misfit Gardening, and this is episode 6, Permaculture Backyard Food Forest. So we're going to be talking all about setting up some mini permaculture areas and designing a backyard food forest. So stay tuned right after this. Welcome back! I'm so excited that you guys are joining me, and today we are talking about permaculture. And permaculture is something I am incredibly passionate about. In fact, I took a permaculture design course in November 2017, and I have been practicing and trying to implement stuff in my backyard ever since. Now, I'm a big believer that permaculture is going to enable people to grow food in ways that they didn't think was really possible, even in a suburban or urban setting. So without further ado, let's dive in and let's talk about permaculture and food forests. So I'm going to use a food forest kind of synonymously with an orchard. And just so you guys are aware that a typical orchard in a permaculture sense is always intensively cultivated and heavily mulched. Okay, the plants are well maintained, they're pruned, they're grafted. We use a lot of chop and drop ground cover and biomass producing plants. So that just means plants that produce like a lot of leaf, or they get big really quickly, and you can chop them down, drop them in place, and that is your mulch. Okay, and then those things will break down and they'll start feeding the soil. And typically these orchards they're stacked in function and height. So by that I mean that you've got different layers of height within the orchard. So you've got different layers of plants, and each one of those plants have got different functions that they're performing in that planting space. So let's dive in with what I mean by that. So there's 7 layers in a typical, permaculture orchard or food forest. So you've got the tall tree layer as your very top layer, and then the layer below that is a low tree layer. Then you have a shrub layer. Then you have a herb layer. Then the ground cover, the vines, and then the roots, or the root layer. But what does that mean, right? You're probably thinking, Emma, I have no idea what this means. So let's take it from the top, literally the very top, okay, the tall tree layer. So these are your full-sized fruit or nut trees, or they can be fast-growing nitrogen-fixing trees, but for most suburban settings, you're not really going to be adding in nitrogen fixing trees. You might add some to help generate shade, and people will typically plant things like a black locust, a linden, silver birch, or robe locust, and that's great because those plants will fix nitrogen in the soil that helps to feed all your other plants. And also those plants will help, they will bloom and they will feed bees. So they can provide food in a different way for you on your suburban homestead. So just a thought. But most suburban homesteaders or gardeners that are looking to do a permaculture food forest, they're looking specifically at food producing plants. So typically in a tall tree layer, or your first layer of the food forest, this is going to be trees like chestnuts or walnuts, maybe some nut-bearing pines, or apples, pears and plums that are on a standard rootstock. So they're the rootstocks that allow your trees to get 25 plus feet. Now, layer number 2 is the low tree layer, and this is your semi-dwarfing or dwarfing fruit trees, and they are typically more shade tolerant, okay? So they are usually made up of your pears, apples, medlars, persimmons, mulberries, but are also plants like apricot, peach, almond, nectarine, mountain ash, also known as rowan, hawthorns, plums, and cherries. And some of those plants like a lot of sun, so they're usually planted towards an end of your food forest where you get a lot of sun. But also, some kind of non-typical plants that are getting kind of built into these sort of backyard food forest designs are plants like pawpaws. And pawpaws are great because they're very shade tolerant. And in fact, when pawpaws are young, you have to keep them in the shade. So they will quite happily grow underneath all of these other fruiting trees. And then when they get a bit bigger, you can look at maybe, cutting back some of your bigger trees to allow space for the pawpaw to develop. So there's lots and lots of exciting things that happen in that low tree layer. And because you can get quite a few of these trees in, especially if you're getting dwarfing rootstocks, you can get a lot of trees in a small space. And if you keep on top of pruning them and keeping them small, you can still keep them being productive without them getting completely out of hand and too tall. Now, layer number 3 is the shrub layer, and this is where a lot of diversity happens. Okay, this is where lots of plants get added in, and this is where you really start mixing things up. So you can have flowering shrubs that are great at attracting wildlife but are not necessarily edible. You can have things like plants that can have many different uses. So you could use something that you can use as basket weaving, so maybe like a basket willow. Or if you like hazelnuts and filberts, you could have those in this layer. But typical plants that are found in this shrub layer include roses, particularly the rugosa roses, which have the really big hips, service berries or amelanchias, hazel, filberts, willow, bamboo, buddleia, also known as butterfly bush, lilac, raspberry, currants, chokeberry, aronia, cornelian cherries, dogwood, sambucus, so elder varieties, rosemary, sage. There's lots and lots and lots of things that you can do in this layer, and this is where it gets really exciting for a lot of people, because these plants fill in some of the space between the lower levels of the non-woody vegetation that comes in the next layer, and also that lower tree canopy. So it's about stacking lots of different plants in an area that are going to have different connections. So I talked about plants being food for the bees earlier, with things like robe locusts or honey locusts and black locusts that people may already have in their backyard already. Well, being able to put into your shrub layer plants like buddleia, butterfly bush, or lilac, a rose, or elder and currants, you're going to bring in more pollinators to that area, because you've got such a big variety of food for them. And of course, the more pollinators that you're going to get in that area, the bigger your harvests are likely to be, because you've got more things pollinating the fruit tree blossoms or your fruiting bush blossoms. So just something to think about. So layer number 4 is the herb layer. So this is non-woody vegetation. It's usually edible or medicinal herbs that get put into here. So they include plants which accumulate nutrients like comfrey, and that produces like a lot of material that's used for mulching. You can also find plants like sweet cicely, parsley, tarragon, dill, fennel, peppers, tomatoes, okra, sorrel, collards, good King Henry, chard, bush beans, echinacea, mint, lemongrass. Oh, the list could go on with the plants that you could put into this herb layer. And number 5 is the ground cover, and that's more like kind of creeping plants. And these are things like creeping chamomile and thyme, clover or strawberries and nasturtiums. And what these guys do is they grow low to the ground and they shade that soil and they reduce the loss of from evaporation basically. So you have like this living mulch area that's on there. And a lot of these plants, you can use in herbal teas, or if it's a strawberry you can eat those. There's just so much that can be done in that area as well. And really your choice in plants is down to what you want that plant to do, and we'll get into that a little bit later. So layer number 6 is the vine layer. So this is perennial vines, usually are kind of fruiting. So they're things like your passion flower, kiwi, hops or grapes, but also things like trumpet flower or honeysuckle and climbing roses and other non-edible vines that are able to attract beneficial insects or birds into that area to help with pest control. The layer also can include annual vines like pole beans or squashes and cucumbers and melons. And finally, the last layer is the root layer. So these are all your rooting crops. So things like daikon radishes, turnips, potatoes, sunchokes, turmeric, ginger, carrots, garlic, sweet potato, licorice, salsify, scorzonera, like all these kind of rooting vegetables and herbs. So you can see within those kind of 7 layers, there's a lot that is going on. And when you are thinking about putting in a backyard food forest, you can see very quickly how you can start to have a lot of food in a small area. So let's have a think about an actual permaculture food forest. So out in part of my side yard, I have a food forest that I set up underneath an existing maple tree. And I know most people are thinking, why would you even do that? It's like the big trees blocking out all of the light. You're not going to get, anything to harvest. Why do that? Well, there's a couple of reasons. So number 1, that tree being there helps to provide leaf litter. So that's going to provide food for those trees going in. It's also helping to kind of reduce the temperature fluctuations of that area. And, really that's something that I wanted to monitor closely, because some of the trees that I moved over to there, they were originally on the south side and we thought they were dead. Like most of the branches and stuff had died back. Like those trees were not in a good state. So I really wanted to provide them with some shade to be able to allow them to kind of rejuvenate themselves. So that's what I did. Now this maple tree that I currently have is getting too big anyway. It's starting to go up into some of the power lines that we have, and by this fall for sure I've got to cut that thing down, because I don't want to be responsible for my neighborhood losing power. So with that in mind, I have 10 fruiting trees all around this one central maple tree, and I have 5 different apple trees. I've got 2 peaches, some plums, pears, and cherries. So I've got lots in that space. Now, what I did was I took my fruiting trees to all be my lower tree layer. And you don't necessarily have to have a high or tree layer or the tall tree layer. In fact, a lot of people don't have one of those when they're creating a backyard food forest, especially in a suburban setting, and that's okay. You know, you could treat your lower tree layer as being the top layer and only having 6 functions that are stacking. And that's perfectly okay. The great thing with permaculture is, you know, you will soon see in these, mini food forests that you're setting up, you will soon see what's thriving and what's not. And the things that thrive will, exponentially grow, and they will do really, really well in that area, and you won't even need to worry about things that haven't done so well. And the plants that do perform the best, especially when it comes to trees, you've got an opportunity to do some grafting, and that's where you can put different varieties onto that tree. So for example, with apples, you can have a tree that's got multiple different varieties of apples that are going to bloom at different times on that one central tree. So that's going to enable you to be able to grow different types on that same plant. Okay, so I'm thinking and giving you ways on how you can really increase the amount of food that you're growing in that space. So in my current permaculture food forest setup, I have quite a few bushes that have just been put in, and these are for the shrub layer. And I have raspberries in there. I have some thimbleberries, dewberries, blackberries. I've got a lot of berry plants as being my shrubs. And the reason for that is because they're delicious and they're something I can cut back each time. And they're things that I wanted to get established because, they're fruiting plants. They're going to provide, food for the chickens and my family. Now I have some other plants that I want to move into that permaculture food forest, and I've got some roses that I want to put into that area, and I also have a lilac. It's not the right time of year for me to be digging those up and moving them. I want to wait until fall to be able to do that. So in early spring I was able to come across some fruit plants, raspberries and stuff that were on sale, so I picked them up and put them straight out in there. Now, number 4, the herb layer. I actually have something a little bit different for my herb layer. I do have some herbs in there, so I've got some bee balm, I have cilantro or coriander, and I've got mint and lemon balm. But what I predominantly did in my backyard food forest is I sowed wildflower seeds all through there. And the reason for me putting wildflowers down there was to, number one, help my beehives out, because there's not a lot of forage in the area that I live. I mean, I'm just kind of peering outside of the window now, and it's just chemically treated lawns, or, just dead grass. There's really not a lot, but when I turn and look outside into my garden, there's just bees and pollinators all over it at the moment. So I really wanted to ensure that my bees had plenty of forage, so I actually planted wildflowers in there, and I just got a Rocky Mountain wildflower mix because I live in that area, so I was able to put those in. My ground cover layer, I actually put in a mixture of clover, and strawberries. And I also have an abundance of squash plants that are currently acting as the ground cover. So these plants are definitely, they're spreading all over that permaculture food forest bed, and they are prolific. I mean, I have got so many pumpkins and squashes that are growing over there. It's crazy. But the great thing is those big leaves, they're shading that ground, they're stopping weeds from growing, and they're keeping that moisture in. Now, the vine layer, I mostly have going in later on this year. So, passion flower, I've not managed to get to grow successfully here in Utah, but I have some wine grapes that I'm wanting to put in. But I think that those might actually just kind of take over the plant instead, because some of the grapevines that I currently have, they're very, very, very vigorous. And you need to be careful, especially with younger trees, that you don't choke out that tree with your vine that's growing. So for me, I'm going to use more annual vines in that area, and I'm going to be putting in some pole beans a little later, but I also have some rambling roses that I'm going to add into that space, and some trumpet flower to be able to provide more forage for the birds and the bees. Now, my current root crops in this area are some onions, sunchokes, and horseradish. So I'm using it more to, grow something that I can harvest later in the season. I don't necessarily want to be disturbing the roots of these plants that are getting established until much later on, when everything's starting to die back. But lots of people grow, this root layer in their permaculture food forests, and typically what they will do is they will put those roots towards the very edge, so kind of like at the drip line. So that's where if it was raining, the water would run off the trees, and it's usually level with the outer branches of those trees, and that's where they will put the roots in there, and it helps to kind of be a barrier to stop kind of grass and things like that coming through. So that's what I have in my backyard. And granted, I do have, a bigger yard than, a lot of what you listeners may have. But I don't want you to get discouraged that, I've only got a small backyard, I can't possibly have a food forest. You really can, and it's just all down to being a little bit clever with what you're choosing to plant. So I mentioned earlier about grafting different varieties onto the same plant. Well, you can buy multi-grafted trees, and I would definitely recommend that if you are in an urban or a suburban setting and you are wanting to put in a food forest, that you get those multi-grafted varieties. So at least 4 of my trees that I currently have are multi-grafted. So I have an apple that's got like 2 or 3 different varieties of apples on it. I have a fruit salad tree which has got like nectarines, apricots, and peaches all on it. I have a cherry tree that's got 3 or 4 different varieties of cherry on it. Same with the plum, it's got multiple varieties of plum on it, and the pear too. So because I have that, not only can I help to ensure I've got better pollination happening because I've got different varieties on there, but I'm also having an extended harvest throughout that season because these varieties are maturing at different times, and I've got a more continual supply of fruit from those trees. Some other tricks that you can consider when you're designing your food forest and where you want it to go is to Think about pruning and how often you are willing to prune your fruit trees. There are lots of ways that you can get more food in by really taking a good stance with pruning, and also doing some training of your trees. Now, way back in Victorian Europe, they had something that's known as like step over apples, and these were apple trees that were so low to the ground you had to step over them, and they were pretty productive. You had to do a lot of pruning to help maintain that, but that's a lower way that you could get away with more food that's in there. Obviously, you have espaliered designs that I think were developed in France. But you have different kind of designs in those, like they can tier them. There's fans that you can do. There's just different ways to be able to train your fruit. And you can even make living fences out of well-trained fruit trees as well. So you can, if you've got two poles that are put in and some tension wire, if you put some fruit trees in there, you can train those branches to go along that tension wire and help produce a screen for you. So that's something that you can really consider as well. Now, the other plants that you're putting in there, they're really down to what you want that space to be. If you're wanting something that's going to be, I don't know, fodder for your chickens to peck at, then you definitely need to, make sure you've got, chicken friendly plants that you're putting in there. You don't want to be putting things like laburnum in there or stuff that's, poisonous to them. But if you're wanting it as being kind of food for you and your family, make sure it's stuff that you enjoy eating. A lot of people will put in strawberries as being kind of the mulch cover. And then maybe they would put in some herbs as being, things that they typically eat. So maybe it's things like chives or sage, stuff that you're typically cooking with. And your shrub layer, maybe it's like me, maybe it's currants and raspberries that you've got growing there, and your vine layer is, some pole beans that you're putting in. The great thing about permaculture is that you get to experiment, and I really encourage people to experiment. In my current permaculture bed, we've got one of our peach trees that kind of has had a lot of stuff self-seed around it, and it's growing really well. So I've got this peach tree, and then underneath the peach tree I've got some bachelor's buttons or cornflowers that are growing all around it, which look beautiful. I also have a random tomato plant that has decided that it wants to grow there, and I have a squash plant, and I have the bee balm growing, and then on the other side, underneath, there's actually some strawberries and clover that are peeking out. So, this peach tree has got its own little food forest that's been set up without any help from me. There was nothing there that I planted. It all just kind of seeded itself there, and you'll find that happen over time. And you just need to be aware that when you're putting in your food forest, you are going to get things that are not going to grow very well, and they are going to die back, and that's okay. These things do happen. You can try again with something else, or you can let things self-seed if that's what you're wanting to do. But if it's something that you want to set in quickly, but you want it to look nice as well, you can definitely put in some nice herbs around your trees, and you could look to putting in some wildflowers as well. And they look really pretty, and the great thing is, number one, they'll probably reseed themselves at the end of the season and should come back next year. But also, a lot of wildflowers, they die back over winter, which enables you to take stock of what worked well and be able to have a think about whether you want to put in some fruit trees or fruit bushes in that space instead. Obviously, the winter months are a great time for you to be able to purchase bare root plants and get those planted as well. So there you have it. That's a very brief overview on permaculture, backyard food forests, and some of the things that I have going on my own homestead, which may work for yours. So thank you very much for tuning in. Until next time, I'm Emma from Misfit Gardening, and you've been listening to Homesteading and Gardening in the Suburbs with Misfit Gardening. I hope you guys have a great rest of your week and that your garden's growing beautifully. Until next time, bye-bye. This podcast uses the song Exhilarate by Kevin MacLeod from Incompetech.com, licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 3.0 license.